In December of 2012, I picked up Ico for the PlayStation 2, a game I had heard some good things about and figured I would give a go. Initially, I was unimpressed with its basic controls, muddy character models, and overall slow pace. But after putting it down and picking it back up again sometime later in 2013, I found that everything which turned me away from the game initially were the exact same things which drew me back in. The controls, while basic, gave the boy you took control of a sense of believable weight, making him feel both predictable yet vulnerable and frail. The character models were ill-defined, but had a distinctive, painterly feel to how they were rendered, somehow still beautifully fitting in with the detailed environment. And when I first played it, I'd never seen a game put so much detailed focus on the environment and the atmosphere. I fully completed the game in March of 2013, and after some simmering and thinking about it, I declared it to be my favorite game. It captured my attention and imagination during and after I played it like no other game ever did before. Every other game I'd played prior to Ico built character relationships and story through cutscenes and dialogue, traditional means of bringing fictional characters together and fleshing them out. And while Ico does have a handful of traditional cutscenes, most of the story is told through gameplay. That story being the flourishing of a friendship between two unlucky young prisoners of a foreboding castle. Instead of giving the player concrete story reasons for caring about Yorda and her well-being, that bond is forged through the gameplay. After a while, I wasn't fighting off shadow monsters to prevent them from triggering the game over state, as it were. I was finding them because the game had conditioned me to view Yorda as someone to protect and to care about. Interacting with Yorda in the moment-to-moment gameplay also served to develop that relationship. Leading Yorda around by holding hands was a simple yet affectionate way to solidify the two as a pair. The act of saving the game by taking a short break on a bench after a long period of playtime is another example of a gameplay mechanic disguised as a tender character moment serving to bring the two together. And although I'm sure there's no way to actually fail having Yorda jump across a bridge and grab onto your hand in the North American version of the game, that didn't mean I wouldn't tense up whenever it happened. The sense of relief I would feel seeing Ico pull Yorda back up to safety was similarly impactful. All of this makes the player and Ico really feel like they're on the same page, like they want the same thing. Ico probably cares for and wants to protect Yorda just as much as the player does, making Ico an excellent audience surrogate character. The end result was that Yorda felt like much more than just a key to open a set of doors to progress a series of challenges. Instead, it felt like you were forging a genuine connection between these two young, lonely travelers. This is before I even get to everything else about the game. The simple yet rewarding puzzle mechanics, the immaculate atmosphere, the artsy camera, the sound design. It was hard not to simply stop and take in the environment at several points in the game, soaking it all in and enjoying the artistry on display. I often found myself slowly walking through areas rather than running through them to fully appreciate everything around me. The final hour or so of the game was a complete cavalcade of emotions. Yorda reaching her hand out towards you for the first time before being separated leads to a feeling of deep isolation and dread. And the ending, where it seems like the fate of both Ico and Yorda remained vague and unknown, made it hard not to get at least a little emotional. Never before had I connected with the game on such an intimate and personal level. But after my initial playthrough ended on that March afternoon, I never touched the game after that. There were a few reasons for this, the first being that Ico, for as wonderful an experience as it is, isn't really built as the type of game you replay frequently. Other classic titles invite you to replay them to master the mechanics, get high scores, rankings, clear times, collectibles, 100% completions, or alternate endings. Ico has none of those, and is a game which I feel is at its sharpest when you don't strive to complete it as fast or as skillfully as possible. It's a game that's meant to be stumbled through, a game where solving the puzzles and stopping to enjoy the artistry and the atmosphere go hand in hand. I was afraid doing multiple playthroughs back-to-back in too short of a time span would dampen the game's impact. Secondly, I loved Ico so much on my first playthrough that not long after finishing the game, I found myself wishing I could play it fresh for the first time all over again. I wish I had appreciated every moment of the game more than I originally did, so that the world and its story could impact me even harder. I wanted that fresh perspective back so badly, in fact, that I ended up dedicating myself to not touching the game at all for 10 whole years, just so I could come as close to re-experiencing a first playthrough of the game as I could. I avoided the game, its online presence, footage of the game, its music, and any discussion of its story as much as I could in the 10 years that followed. I would later go on to play Fumito Ueda's other games like Shadow of the Colossus and The Last Guardian in the meantime, but never could I allow myself to touch Ico until a full 10 years had passed. I would continue to tell people that Ico was my favorite game ever, but when pressed for specifics and an explanation as to why, I would stop, committed to recalling as little about the game. So badly was I eager to see if I actually could recapture that paradoxical second first playthrough. So as I began to start the game again after 10 years, now in my mid-20s, several questions began to overcome me. How much of the game did I actually still remember? Would I rediscover why I initially found the game to be so dull and frustrating when I first picked it up? Would the story still impact me the same way it did for me as a teenager? And above all else, after a decade of experiencing other video games, old and new, would it still be my favorite game? Well, to start, just like how my memories of the game were a little hazy, the game itself turned out to be hazier than I remembered too. Ico is one of the few PlayStation 2 games that does not natively run at 480i, instead going for a progressive but still overall lower resolution of 240p. This reduces jaggies but makes the game a bit blurrier than your average PS2 game. Add that on top of some pretty noticeable motion blur and a prevalence of bloom lighting, and some areas of the game simply weren't as clear as I remembered, or as I would have liked, even on emulator, which is where all the footage in this video is coming from, by the way. If you do end up playing Ico on real PS2 hardware, get yourself a nice pair of component cables to get at least a bit more clarity out of the picture, or play it on a CRT television. I mentioned earlier I disliked how the models of the game looked when I first started playing, but warmed up to them over time. Yorda's model in particular is stylized in a way I think still holds up today. Ico's model is okay, he's blocky in some places, and his facial animations can be a bit odd, but rarely are you treated to a close-up of him outside of cutscenes, and his animations during gameplay are so detailed for the time that the model's shortcomings don't really matter all that much. Besides, it's the environment which makes Ico a gorgeous game, not the character models. I still can't get over how this is a PlayStation 2 game in 2001 that looks like this. I was surprised to rediscover how important I found color to be in Ico. The insides of the castle feature mostly a dull shade of brown, but occasionally the saturated light shining through windows and into the interiors gives the castle a sense of life and beauty. Find yourself in an outside area with bright and saturated grass, and it contrasts against the brick of the castle, also causing Ico and Yorda to stand out. I had to squint my eyes entering the outside areas again, because I was caught so off guard over how bright the grass was. I think what I appreciated the most on this long-awaited revisit were the infinitesimally small details which I probably didn't appreciate all that much the first time around. For example, holding Yorda's hand and walking around causes the controller to gently vibrate, as if you're feeling the rhythm of her footsteps through your hand as you walk around the castle. It's a creative and immersive little detail, one that's best enjoyed with a DualShock 2, preferably on real hardware. On emulator, the vibration isn't nearly as gentle as it's supposed to be, turning a subtle touch into a not-so-subtle one. Another detail I really enjoyed was that Ico could face Yorda as she sits on a bench by holding R1. Ico being able to make eye contact with Yorda, a non-verbal gesture, to invite her to join him during a moment's rest, provides the player a delicate and quiet way to strengthen their bond without being too overt or corny. I think if Ico did something like pat his hand on the seat next to him to invite Yorda over, it wouldn't have the same impact. But both options are better than the PAL version, which just shows Iko flailing his arms around and speaking directly to Yorda. Not nearly as artsy as the US version. In fact, it might be the only advantage the US version has over PAL, in my opinion. There were also moments like this, which I had absolutely no memory of when playing this game for a second time. Surprises like this made me really feel like I was experiencing Iko for the first time again. The presence of tension in the game was also something I was surprised to rediscover. You can leave Yorda behind to solve puzzle challenges in order to create safe ways for her to traverse. But entering a loading zone into another area and spending too much time without her will cause shadow monsters to spawn in the area that you left her in. This creates a sort of tension whenever you have to leave Yorda behind in order to solve a puzzle, because at any moment she could be in danger. One careless mistake of leaving your friend behind could be your last. There are also scripted moments for the shadows to appear when you're already away from Yorda, forcing you to act fast and find the fastest way back to her before the shadows can take her away, which is also effective in giving the gameplay a sort of uncertain tension. You never know when you'll get into another fight, just that another fight is certainly coming. Combat in Iko isn't deep or anything, it's essentially frantic button mashing, but I think for what it's supposed to be, the combat succeeds spectacularly. The limitations of the combat help put you in the shoes of a frail child, desperately fighting to save their one and only friend in a cold and unforgiving prison. If I was in Iko's shoes and all I had to protect my friend was a dinky little stick, then yeah, it would probably look and feel a lot like this. I also like how reaching a set of doors with Yorda expels any shadow monsters in the room you're currently in. It creates a good sense of risk and reward, deciding whether it's best to go for the door or flail away at the enemies in the heat of the moment is pretty exciting. I enjoyed the thrill of making a beeline towards the door as every monster in the area gave chase, just barely escaping their grasp. Mechanically, the game is just simple enough for what it needs to be. Iko can run, jump, shimmy on ledges, climb, and swing on chains. It helps that Iko automatically grabs onto anything he's able to when in midair, which helps keep the gameplay simple and easy to understand. But jumping with Iko felt much stiffer than what I remembered, as you can't change your direction in midair at all once you've committed to a jump. I might have forgotten this since all of Fumito Ueda's other games allow you to move slightly in the air after a jump, but it's still something I had mixed feelings upon rediscovering. On the one hand, Iko feels weighty and realistic in a way that Wander from Shadow of the Colossus simply doesn't. But on the other hand, Iko's sudden and rigid jump led to more deaths than I would have liked. Which was especially unpleasant because checkpoints in Iko can sometimes be a little brutal. You get a checkpoint every time you enter a door and every time you reach a bench. But by late game, you'll be doing puzzles for 15 to 20 minutes, and all it takes is one bad jump to undo all of that progress. Waiting for Yorda's AI to catch up to what I actually want her to do also occasionally serves to take me out of the experience. It's not a huge deal, mind you, it rarely ever happens, but it can still happen and is frustrating when it does. Luckily, a lot of the frustrations I had experienced with Iko on my initial playthrough didn't really seem to pop up this time. I remembered my first playthrough being about 7 hours or so, while my second playthrough was around 5. I specifically still remembered 2 puzzles which gave me a lot of trouble 10 years ago, and how angry I was when I had to Google their solutions. I guess that anger still existed somewhere in the back of my brain because I knew what to do in these parts almost immediately. My survival instincts kicked in here, I suppose. Sound was also something I was joyful to rediscover. There is no music throughout the majority of Iko. Most of the music is saved for specific cutscenes and the semi-frequent encounters with the shadowy figures. But what does play is pretty otherworldly and gets the mood of the castle across fairly well. My favorite has to be the Save Bench theme. Getting to hear this track after a decade made me feel like I had stepped into my childhood room after a lifetime and seeing everything being exactly where I remembered it was. Am I being a little bit too sentimental for a dinky little save theme that's less than a minute long? Maybe, but it's genuine sentimentality if I've ever felt it. The minimalism of the story and presentation was still something I really appreciated about the game. Outside of the pause menu and save menus, Eco has no HUD elements, the world always on full display without any distractions. I also liked how I was usually always able to tell what could and couldn't be grabbed and interacted with simply by the camera panning and nudging me in the right direction. No waypoint marker or oddly colored objects sticking out in the environment to take you out of the experience. The praise of minimalism also extends to the story of the game. I still like how many unanswered questions are in Eco's plot without it feeling frustrating, instead allowing the world to still live in my head after I'm done playing as I ponder away at what everything means. Like, who is this girl we're protecting, and what are the actual extent of her abilities? And by the same token, to what extent was the Queen telling the truth when she said Yorda cannot live and survive outside of the castle walls? Was she lying when she said this? And to the extent that Eco and Yorda survive in the ending, that the epilogue isn't a dream or the afterlife, it's impossible not to ponder and guess and speculate as to what their lives might become after reuniting on the beach. These mysteries after everything is said and done intrigue rather than frustrate me because the emotional core of the story, a friendship between two young children, is the core focus of the journey. But all of that brings me to the whole reason I stayed away from Eco for a decade. What I wanted was to forget everything about it and try to relive the experience of playing it for the first time again. And while it was a joy to rediscover the finer details that helped heighten everything else I loved about the game, the fact remains that I remembered a lot of the broad strokes, including the story and the game's finale. As impactful as getting to hear you were there while watching the credits roll after so much time was, I still knew where the story was going to go, from the moment I hit start to the game's final shot. After all that time, I couldn't completely expel Eco from my mind like I wanted to. Maybe it was a mark of just how great the game was, or maybe it was a fool's errand all along, to try to forget about my favorite game, no matter how long I sought to avoid it. But even still, I'm glad I made the effort to play it again after waiting so long, because while I do still think Eco is probably my favorite game, it also helped me remove the rose-tinted glasses and see the flaws in it, and how a lot of those flaws aren't really present in the games made today. The gaming landscape has changed a lot since Eco was released, just as much as I've changed in the 10 years I've waited to finally revisit it. My values and what I connect with have also shifted just as dramatically. Even the content on this channel has changed dramatically over time, as I'm sure you've noticed if, you've been here a while. So while Eco still, today, is my favorite game, I think after my second playthrough, I'm now ready to find a game I'll cherish and connect with even more, whenever that may be, and whatever that game is. If there's one thing I want you to take away from this video, besides the fact that Eco is amazing and that you should play it, even if you haven't already after watching this whole video, is to cherish your first playthrough of any given game, even games you think you may not enjoy. Because you never know if it will be something you cherish so much, you wish that you could forget it ever happened at all.